When you're a child, you experience something called emotional socialization, meaning your family teaches you how to regulate and express emotions, what sorts of emotions are okay for who to express, how power in the family system correlates to what emotions you're allowed to express and how you're allowed to express them. For example, something that will commonly happen is sometimes kids are told they're not allowed to feel angry at adults simply because they hold less power in the system, or sometimes the family system will revolve around one person's emotions, kind of like the squeaky wheel gets the grease expression, and other less powerful family members aren't allowed to express their emotions while that one person can sort of like emotionally vomit however much they want. But what happens when you choose to exit a relationship and go no contact with one or both parents? Well, I came across a 2025 study that wanted to look at exactly that. It wanted to know, number one, how do people re-socialize themselves emotionally after going no contact? And number two, how does it affect their perceived well-being? With qualitative studies like this, the findings aren't necessarily meant to be representative of the general population, but I think you'll find after hearing what the findings were that a lot of what the participants say echoes what a lot of people who have gone no contact with family members say about how they try to emotionally re-socialize themselves. So let's dive in. So the study in question had 30 participants from the US, UK, and Canada. It included both adult children and parents who were estranged. 26 of them were adult children, 4 of them were estranged parents. They were aged 28 to 77, and the mean age was 46. Regarding the adult children, 30% were estranged from their mom, 23.3% from their dad, and 33.3% from both. And in terms of the parents, all of them were moms, and 3 of them were estranged from their daughters, 1 of them was estranged from their son. The researchers did online semi-structured interviews, and they analyzed participants' themes in what they were saying. The researchers then broke them down into the following categories. Number 1, emotional socialization, meaning their view of early family life. Number 2, transitional, meaning during the exit when they decided to go no contact with a parent or parents. And number 3, emotional resocialization. Now, what is emotional resocialization? Well, in a family system, people can either maintain the emotional order or disrupt it. And for those who choose to disrupt it by exiting the family, emotional resocialization simply means how they unlearn old emotional rules and learn new ones. And the 4th category was impact on perceived well-being. So what were the findings? Let's start with early emotional socialization. Estranged parents recalled feelings of warmth and closeness with their children when they were young, which is interesting because while, as you'll see in a moment, adult children also recalled some warmth and closeness from their childhoods, it was kind of more just like sprinkled into a recipe that otherwise largely contained some really bad ingredients. And these estranged parents felt confused as to why their child decided to exit the relationship because, again, as they recall it, they had a lovely upbringing. However, there was one thing that estranged parents talked about, which was parental conflict and divorce. And this is something that I often hear estranged parents talking about, and it makes me reflect on a couple of things. First of all, I think it's sometimes easier to take responsibility for the ways that you indirectly harmed your child than it is for the ways that you directly harmed them. So sometimes it can be easier for parents to say, yeah, I recognize that I went through a messy divorce, or I had a high conflict, abusive relationship with my husband or whatever, and that I'm sure affected my child, but then not really recognizing the ways in which they directly harmed their child according to what the child themselves says. The second interesting thing about this is that the relationship between parents is extremely important. This is why when people have kids and they sort of neglect their romantic relationship, it's not going to be good for the kids either. They think I'm just doing everything for the children, I'm just focusing on them, they're my number one priority. But if you don't have a secure relationship as the foundation of the household, everything else is going to crumble. That's why it's still very, very important to prioritize the romantic partnership. And it also shows that families are highly interconnected. The relationship between the two people who are holding together the family, if that falls apart, of course, is going to negatively affect the children as well. Nothing happens in a vacuum. So how you treat your partner, how they treat you, even things as specific as the type of physical affection that you and your partner show to each other have been shown to have a huge impact on children who are witnessing that and are learning that as the blueprint of the way that relationships should be. So that was about the estranged parents. But regarding the adult children, all the adult children in the study reported experiencing abuse in early life, if not physical, then emotional. Emotional abuse generally consisted of neglect, feelings of abandonment, emotional distance, verbal attacks, typically targeting the self-esteem and self-worth of the child, exhibiting emotional authority over the child and gaslighting. And the adult children in the study recognized that the previous generation, their parents' generation, probably wouldn't have considered those things abusive. And yet that is the way that they experienced them. They also reported experiencing a lot of chaos and volatility in the household growing up, which resulted in trauma and anxiety for them. They also reported abandonment by their parents. And a lot of them also felt this sense of conditional acceptance. Their parents were more concerned about how their child influenced their public role and image rather than authentically investing in the parent-child relationship. However, like I mentioned, they did also remember some warmth and closeness. And I think this is noteworthy for a couple of reasons. First of all, it shows that adult children are able to recognize the nuance. They're able to recognize I was abused, and yet there were also times when I felt warm and close and loved by my parent. And that sort of duality sometimes is lacking in the way that I hear estranged parents talking about their kids' upbringing. The second thing that I find interesting about this is that it's not unusual for parents with certain personality styles or certain parenting styles to idealize their kids when they're very, very small, when they're very dependent and sort of malleable. And then as that child starts to develop a sense of autonomy, personal agency, starts deviating from what the parent wants for them, that idealization can very quickly turn into devaluation. Before I tell you about what happened when the participants cut off their parent and afterwards, I want to reflect on something. A lot of estranged parents will use this attitude of like, I did and I sacrificed so much for you as a reason why kids are indebted to them and should feel guilty if they cut them off. And I find it really odd because you chose to have that child. They didn't ask to be born. When we hold something over a person's head that they never asked for, that's the definition of emotional blackmail. It's like if somebody is really in need of money and they don't ask you for money, but you say, here, take this money, I insist. And they take it because they really need it at that point in time. Then years later, you say to them, you're not going to come to my birthday party, but I gave you money that one time. It's kind of like that because children, when they're small, they're very helpless. They're in need, kind of like that person who really needs the money, but they didn't ask for it. They didn't ask to be born. And so it's really messed up when parents try to hold that over a child's head. I think what it comes down to is that parenting is really, really hard. And yeah, it does require a lot of sacrifices. And parents sometimes struggle with that. They don't know what to do with it, so they just kind of offload it onto their child. Parenting is definitely the hardest thing I've ever done, and I feel like I've done pretty hard things in my life. My child is currently in the transition from baby to toddler, and my husband and I wanted to do something to sort of freshen up our parenting skills while we go into this stage that is, infamous for how toddlers can be a little bit more hands-on, let's just put it that way. So we watched the Science of Parenting class on Masterclass, who is kindly sponsoring this portion of the video. And the first episode of the class focused on parental burnout. I've heard in my time people say yes, it's so hard to be a parent, validating about that. But there's something about classes that I watch on Masterclass specifically that just encodes differently in my brain for some reason. Because when I heard those parenting experts in that class providing validation about the fact that parental burnout is at an all-time high, it kind of made me crumble inside. And I know that when I turn on Masterclass, it's about to change my brain chemistry. Like with any streaming service, when you turn it on, you get a little excited. It's like, ooh, what am I going to watch today? But with Masterclass, it's a step beyond that because I know that whatever I'm going to choose has the potential to deeply transform me. Masterclass is a library of over 200 courses and thousands of lessons in a variety of fields like writing, business, tech, health and wellness, cooking. It's a membership-based streaming service that bills annually at $10 per month. New classes are always being added to the library, so you can stream anytime, anywhere at your own pace. Get up to 50% off your annual Masterclass subscription. Just click the link in this video's description or scan the QR code on screen so that they know that I sent you. Learn from the best to become your best with Masterclass. So back to that study, what happened when adult children decided to go no contact with their parents? What happened during that transition time? Regarding the estranged parents, they reported feeling a lot of confusion. One parent said, I went into depression. What happened? Am I that bad of a parent? I must be that bad of a parent. What did I do wrong? Why did my child do this to me? And I had just remarried. I thought part of that she might have hated, but I'm glad that I had because I could not get out of bed. It was very traumatic. She said, I just need time. I said, that's fine, but I really would like to talk so we can clear things up. She had no interest in that. I found this quote to be quite revealing because there is so much emphasis in it on the self. So much me, I, and not really much focus at all on what the child must be feeling. We have to remember that as parents, our priority is always the child's well-being. So if a child does something as substantial as choosing to estrange themselves from us, and it never crosses our mind, how could it get to this point for them? How bad must things be for them emotionally to do this? How are they dealing with this? How are they coping with not having their parent? I think that's very revealing. It reveals a very sort of egocentric lens that I'm assuming also played a role in the reasons why their child no longer speaks to them. Also, this quote seemed to focus a lot on self-esteem, and particularly had a very black and white view of self-esteem, like I must be a bad parent, rather than, maybe I was a parent who made some mistakes, and clearly that had some ramifications that are pretty long-lasting. And the way it's phrased almost makes it sound like the estrangement is a kind of abuse, something that was done to them, something that was traumatic for them. And then in the end, we also see some boundary violations where the daughter said, I just need some time, and the mom said, yeah, that's great, but can we actually talk though? The estranged parents during this transition period reported a lot of abandonment, anxiety, chaos, and volatility. And I found it really interesting that these estranged parents felt many of the same things that adult children reported feeling growing up. It brings to mind this quote that how you treat your kids when they need you is how they're going to end up treating you when they no longer need you. Obviously, it's a little bit more complex than that. Like there are permissive parents who end up raising kids who treat them poorly and didn't abuse them or mistreat them, but rather were too lenient, too coddling. But generally speaking, I do think it rings true for situations where parents mistreated their child, that at some point, the things that you did to them, the ways that you mistreated them, they're going to come back and bite you in the butt. It's kind of like an emotional karma. How you made someone feel when they were helpless is probably how you're at some point going to feel when you're helpless, when they no longer need you. Another theme that came up during this transition period for parents was boundary management and hope and reconciliation. As for the adult children, they experienced a myriad of difficult emotions such as confusion, anger, anxiety, again, chaos and volatility, trauma. This is to be expected with any sort of attachment rupture, but certainly with one as integral as the parent-child relationship. And, sometimes like anti-estrangement therapists and such will say this as like a reason why you should reconnect with people because, you experience painful emotions when you decide to cut them off. But I don't think that this should be a reason to discourage people from estrangement because you don't know if they would feel even more painful emotions if they stayed in the relationship. It's kind of like, imagine that somebody's in a toxic relationship. Of course, breaking up with them is painful, but that doesn't mean that staying in a toxic relationship would be any less painful for them long term. Adult children also reported a bunch of boundary violations from their parents. They said that their parents repeatedly tried to contact them even after they asked them not to, which resulted in anger and further distance from them. I experienced this with a friend one time where I asked them to not contact me again. They did not. Never in my life have I felt more sure of my decision to cut off a person than given how they continuously disrespected my request for space. Now, you'll sometimes hear estranged parents talking about how they're not sure how to leave the door open for their child to come back in their life while respecting their request to keep their distance. And I think that it's actually quite simple. All it takes is when your child is telling you they're cutting you off, simply saying something along the lines of, I'm so sorry that our relationship has caused you this much pain. I love you. I'm always going to be here if you change your mind. Please let me know if you'd like to reconnect after taking whatever space you need. Quite honestly, if I were estranging myself from a parent and they sent me this message, I probably wouldn't need very much space from them in the first place. Another theme was gaslighting, which the study didn't give very many specifics on this, but we can kind of imagine. A lot of estranged parents deny what their children bring up when they're about to estrange themselves. And sometimes the facts of like what actually happened during their childhood is less important than the emotional impact on the child, the story that the child internalized and ran with. Let's think about like a child who hears their parents fighting and they hear their mom saying to their dad that he had an emotional affair. And years later, the child brings this up to the mom and says, this really traumatized me at the time. It caused a lot of trauma to me to hear this as a child. And imagine that then the mom says, oh my God, no, that's totally not what happened. I was actually experiencing paranoia at the time. Your dad never had an emotional affair. Instead of acknowledging the very real harm that it did on the child. The child didn't know that she was undergoing paranoia at the time. The child internalized from that experience what they internalized from it. It's not really worth negotiating the facts of what actually happened or how they misinterpreted the situation, so much as it is important to address the emotional impact that it had. If we're being honest, neither party can remember in a completely unbiased and perfect way what happened years ago. That doesn't change the way that the memory got emotionally encoded for the person that it harmed. And adult children also reported experiencing financial abuse and financial cutoffs as a result result of choosing to no longer be in relationship with their parent. I don't blame a parent who decides to not pour more money into somebody who doesn't want a relationship with them. Nobody is owed our money. But I would think that if you genuinely love your child, you'd want them to have resources once you're gone, no matter how things are between the two of you, unless you think it's not in their best interest. Like if they, let's say, have a substance misuse problem and you think that they're going to blow through their inheritance if you give them that money. But unfortunately, the way that a lot of estranged parents talk about financially cutting off their children doesn't sound like they're doing it out of love, but rather more as a form of revenge or, again, emotional blackmail. It sends the message that my support of you is conditional on your obedience, and if you don't do what I want, then you don't get the very tangible benefits of being my child. Let me show you something that an estranged parent recently posted on TikTok.
Help you with your down payment to get into your home? Fuck you. Yeah, help you buy your fucking furniture for your house, all the decorations for your fucking house. Fuck you. I'm gonna sit back and I'm gonna watch God be God. And I'm gonna sit here and I'm gonna watch God take everything away from you. Your job that your daddy got you. Your house that your mom and daddy got you. And you wonder why he hasn't gave you a child yet.
It's also interesting to me when estranged parents say that their children used them for money, because this study shows quite the opposite is true. When children go no contact, they are sacrificing certain financial resources for their peace of mind. How are they using you for money if they're saying, I don't want any of that? And for the adult children also, hope and reconciliation was a theme as well. Now, what about the resocialization process? What happened after the transition period years later? The estranged parents experienced anxiety, emptiness, emotional conflict, but also acceptance, emotional safety, improved boundaries. One thing that they particularly struggled with was the loss of their status as grandparents. More on that in a second. As for the adult children, they also experienced painful emotions long-term. Anger, anxiety, trauma, emptiness, emotional conflict, but also positive emotions like emotional freedom, emotional safety, improved self-esteem, self-worth, personal agency, boundaries, a sense of acceptance. However, one thing that they emphasized was how they were sort of unable to forgive their parent because their parent never really took responsibility. Researchers say when they attempted to share their early experiences with their parents dismissed, refused to accept, or avoided the topic altogether. This further cemented adult children's acceptance of disconnection. One participant said, I would say, what happened when you did not come get me from school? The father would be like, I do not know. I do not remember that. There was never any information. He could not talk about anything real, basically. And so the researchers talk about how a lot of these adult children had to find compassion for their parents, an understanding of like why they turned out the way they did because of their own intergenerational trauma, but not necessarily acceptance or forgiveness. Because in a lot of ways, forgiveness does sort of require the person asking you for forgiveness. It kind of depends on like how you define forgiveness. Definitions vary widely, but that was what was found in this study. And similarly to how estranged parents experienced the loss of their status as grandparents, adult children experienced the loss of extended family quite often, which diminished their social status. Sometimes you will hear estranged parents talking about how they lost their grandchildren and they get very vengeful about the fact that they no longer have access to those kids. And to be sure, it must be extremely painful to know that you have grandchildren out there and to not be able to have a relationship with them. But I don't as often see adult children getting very vengeful and angry over the fact that they no longer have access to certain family members as a result of going no contact with a parent. It's like when people think that they're entitled to a relationship with the child of somebody that they've treated horribly. No, you're sadly not owed a relationship with that child if the only connection you have to them is via a relationship that no longer exists or a relationship that you've completely deteriorated. Like let's say that you have a friend breakup and all of that person's close friends who you sort of became a friend with, but maybe not that closely. Once you break up with that friend, they decide they no longer want to hang out with you. That seems to me somewhat reasonable, depending on the context. If they still want to keep hanging out with you, that's great. But if they decide it's weird to keep hanging out with you because their only connection to you was via that one friend that you're no longer friends with, I don't know, man, you don't really have a right to be vengeful about that. And adult children also reported a loss of family history, like them trying to figure out, certain medical information about their family of origin to better understand their own medical struggles and how, that was difficult because they didn't have a relationship with their parent or parents. Now, the last category, like I mentioned, was well-being outcomes. It seems like both parents and children found new social supports, new healing modalities, whether it be therapy, spirituality, alternative medicine. They lost their old capital, but they built a new one. They also reported stigma. For the parents, it was perceived stigma because they didn't actually share with other people a lot about their estrangement, whereas for adult children, it was both perceived and actual stigma because a lot of them did share about the estrangement and experienced judgment for it. And also, there was a lot of mental health labeling among both categories. Adult children often labeled their parents with narcissism as a way to try to make sense of their behavior. There was an example of one parent who was told by, it seems like her own psychiatrist, like her own therapist who she referred her daughter to as well. That therapist told her that her daughter has BPD and that their relationship is never going to get better, which, like, anytime people paraphrase stuff like this from their therapist, I'm like, I don't know if that's really how they said it. But certainly doesn't sound like the most ethical therapist in the world if they were taking on such a massive conflict of interest. And, it's probably true in some cases. There are a lot of untreated personality disorders out there, and some of them are bound to end up in estrangement. And, family members might catch on that there's something going on with that person's personality. But we don't need to pathologize a person's entire global character in order to feel confident that they've harmed us. You can just say, this person harmed me without saying this person is a narcissist if that doesn't necessarily fit their situation. And sometimes, I'll be honest, I do think it's a form of projection. A lot of people will say this person is a narcissist because they have within themselves certain narcissistic traits that they're not able to look at for whatever reason. And the adult children also talked about how initially they were very emotionally suppressed, and when they re-socialized themselves emotionally, they built new skills and new norms around emotions. So what are the takeaways of the study? When you choose to disrupt the emotional rule book in your family, it's at first going to be very painful. It might inadvertently feel for the parents the way the childhood felt for the kids. Once that initial transition period has stabilized, there's both grief and emotional freedom. And when people are no contact with somebody who was previously not great for them, they have the ability to build new emotional norms, to make their own sort of family or system-wide rules about what emotions look like, to build different supportive relationships, to feel more empowered in themselves. There are for sure some trade-offs, like the loss of old capital, the loss of grandchildren, extended family, financial benefits. But in my opinion, the people who choose to sacrifice those things do so because the emotional cost of staying is just not worth it for them. What did you think of this study? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to check out Masterclass.
Tell me what you need.